Hello and welcome to our latest AIB webinar on how MNEs contribute to social issues in developing countries. My name is Klaus Meyer and I'm the coordinator for this series. As most of you know, probably, we have created this forum for sharing research published in our two journals, Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of Business Policy. And the idea is to both listen to the experts on the key insights from their research and use that as a basis to discuss broader issues of interest to the research community within international business. You as audience can actively participate in the discussion. Please use the Q&A function where you can input your questions, which then go to the attention of our moderator, who will then pick questions from that Q&A list to ask to the panelists. And even if you don't have a question, you can go and have a look what other questions other people ask, and because you can vote for questions, so and the more votes a question get, the more likely it gets to the attention of the moderator. Let me just do the usual introduction. My thanks go to my co-conspirators here in setting this up, of course, the two editors of the journal, as well as the AIB board. Technical support comes from Renfrey Gow in Manchester and Tunga Kiak. And web coordinators is myself and Tim Deviney, and I would like to especially welcome Dana Minbayeva. Dana, can you just say hello? Dana will take over as co-coordinator for the series going forward, and she will be taking over my role or Tim's role in the near future. Hello.
Hello and welcome. Thank you.
Now let me introduce Jonathan Doe, who is the moderator for today's panel. Jonathan is Associate Dean of Research and Global Engagement at Villanova School of Business. Jonathan, of course, as many of you know, has a distinguished record of doing research on social impact issues, especially on many people associate his name with work on the relationship of non-governmental organizations and the multinational enterprise, which is the appropriate background to lead a discussion into the social responsibility of multinational enterprises. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Klaus. Thank you, AIB colleagues. It's really a delight to be here with you today. I'm in Villanova, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And just by way of introduction, I think we've all observed that societal expectations of multinational enterprises to become more sustainable and more responsible in their activities have grown. We've seen this in the popular and business press. And the catalyst for those pressures and those expectations comes from a whole different range of sources, including non-governmental organizations, which Klaus said is one of my areas of interest in research, but I think civil society, more broadly. And we've unfortunately had some significant events that were kind of galvanizing moments, such as the Rana Plaza accident in 2013, which Rajneesh is going to speak about a little bit. And more recently, I happened to take a look at a book called Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. And this author describes, unbeknownst to many consumers, that things that we buy at fast fashion retailers like H&M and others perhaps are sometimes produced in pretty harsh slave labor, what they would call slave labor conditions. And so there's really been, I think, a growing sensitivity and challenge around these issues, and many multinationals have responded in one fashion or another, either through their direct activities, through their collaborations with non-governmental organizations and governments, or, as we're going to hear about today a bit, through their interactions with suppliers and other partners in their global supply chains. So reflecting this increased interest, I think broadly, the IB research community has really stepped up, and we've seen an increasing propensity of IB scholars looking into these issues, often bringing multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary perspectives. And we're going to hear about some of that today, relying on IB theory, but also drawing from allied social sciences. In this regard, I happen to be involved in a JIB special issue. Klaus, if you maybe bring that call for papers out with a number of colleagues, that really focuses front and center on issues of sustainability, of private governance, that is, various private regulatory initiatives from NGOs or other groups, industry groups, that serve as quasi-regulation, and particularly around supply chain issues. And so I will put a call for papers in the chat for the special issue. For those of you that are interested, you can see the special issue editors on the slide, and we invite you to approach any of us should you have questions about the special issue in terms of what we may be looking for, what may be appropriate. So with that as introduction, I want to turn now to the three papers we're going to hear from, and we really have a nice collection here. The first paper from Hans Kolk and colleagues is really a literature review, multinationals, international business, and poverty, a cross-disciplinary research overview and conceptual framework. That'll be our first presentation. Then we're going to hear from Rajneesh Narula, a paper called Enforcing High Labor Standards with within developing country value chains, consequences for MNEs and informal actors in the dual economy. This is really more of a perspectives type paper where Rajneesh explores some of the opportunities, but also some of the unplanned consequences or unforeseen consequences of sort of ramping up these expectations. And then finally, we have an empirical paper from Anthony Gerzin and colleagues that looks specifically at the role of auditing and the role of interventions in improving the social compliance among upstream suppliers. So as I said, our first presenter is Hans Kolk, and Hans is, I think, probably not unfamiliar to most of you. I really view Hans as a leader at the intersection of research on international business, corporate responsibility, and sustainability. She's won a number of awards for her research in terms of its social impact. She received the EBIS Aspen Institute Faculty Pioneer Award. And so she's really been at the vanguard, I think, of those trying to integrate and speak to both international business and broader business and society communities. So each presenter is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and I'll turn things over to Hans for the first presentation.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everybody, from snowy Amsterdam, which is quite unusual. What is the role of multinational enterprises and international business activity in poverty alleviation? After decades of highly interesting research in development economics, policy, and more recently business, debates are still ongoing. And while complementary literatures often do not engage with one another, we examined insights from key journals in the respective fields to bring them into the debate on IB policy. Although we considered published research at all levels of analysis, our focus is on business activities with an impact on absolute poverty in low-income countries, either directly led by multinationals or with a strong IB dimension, such as global value chains, which may or may not directly involve an MNE. To organize and connect the different findings of the different literatures, we developed a broader cross-disciplinary framework mapping the main relationships emerging from them. So in this way, we help set a research agenda on the impact of MNEs and IB on poverty that highlights the importance of interaction effects and contextual dimensions. So here's the framework. Our framework seeks to not only disentangle the impact of different types of MNE activities on the left-hand side, on different dimensions of poverty on the right-hand side, but also to connect the impact of these activities to country and industry activities on characteristics on the bottom, thereby emphasizing the importance of considering the context when exploring multinationals' impacts on poverty. Now moving to poverty. Obviously, poverty has been one of the key dimensions of not only the Sustainable Development Goals, but already before the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. And the definition and measurement of poverty has significantly evolved over time. Now, in the international business and management literature, we tend to conceptualize poverty in terms of income levels, but the economic development and development studies literature suggests that poverty is a multidimensional construct that cannot be reduced to a simple analysis of income levels. And so this is where we follow these literatures. We also rely on the World Bank 2000 seminal reports that identifies 5 distinct, albeit interrelated dimensions of poverty. So I will quickly go through all 5 of them. So material deprivation is the most intuitive of the 5. And it occurs when income is too low to cover the expenses incurred to meet basic needs, so food, shelter, and clothing. Lack of education, the second, refers to situations in which education levels are too low for the poor to be able to not only protect themselves, and avoid harmful decisions, but also to recognize and take advantage of income-generating opportunities. The third dimension of poverty includes ill health and lack of access to health services and medication, quite obviously in these days. Ill health directly leads to a higher prevalence of disabilities among the poor and shorter life expectancies and to low income earning potential, as it's harder for people with poor health to keep physically demanding jobs. Vulnerabilities, the fourth dimension, is high exposure to risk, which includes health issues and disabilities, but also in many cases violence, economic dislocation, environmental degradation, and a higher prevalence of natural disasters. And then finally, poverty is also characterized by voicelessness and exclusion, which can be defined as the lack of influence on decisions that can impact one's life and the exclusion from formal institutions. So now the literature suggests that these dimensions of poverty are strongly interrelated and cannot be fully analyzed if you take them separately. And that's not only because they represent different aspects of poverty, but also because they influence each other. For example, ill health can lead to lower income, while low income can increase voicelessness, for example. So considering the left-hand side of the framework, we found that half of the papers that we have focus on the impact of globalization and trade in general, and the other half focus on the impact of firm-specific decisions on a given community. And although originating from different objective assumptions and methodologies, the literatures call for attention to the potentially differential impact of non-purposive versus purposive action. So the issue of intent is important here. So the development economics and development studies literature mainly focus on the impact of globalization, and we find actually two types of globalization. One is the impact of mainstream globalization, meaning increased trade, investments, and international transfers as a percentage of GDP. And then there's responsible globalization, that is globalization spearheaded by actors who view poverty alleviation and sustainability as key goals of trade. Now, when we look at the firm-specific decisions and their impacts on poverty alleviation, it's slightly more complex picture emerges. And we have divided them into three. One is if the firm can have an impact through their core business activities. Now, this is most well known, right? So, this is even when they don't consider poverty alleviation as their main goal of their activity. So this relates to FDI, which can have both positive and negative effects on the different dimensions of poverty, regardless of the goals, and it also applies to global value chains now. The next paper will be directly about this. Then the second, firms can embed in their core activities the specific goal of poverty alleviation, leading to firm decisions that take into account the impact they can have on the poor. Here again, you have investment, for example, bottom of the pyramid type of activities, if that includes investment, social entrepreneurship, microfinance, and also fair trade. And then the third set that, this may be slightly controversial, but we call it here peripheral business activities, meaning activities that are important, but generally not regarded as part of a firm's core business functions in poverty alleviation. So this is, philanthropic type of activities. And well, this is an interesting area for research. Finally, the country and industry effects on the bottom that moderate the relationship between MNEs and AIB on one side and poverty on the other also emerge from the review, with 4 different types of effect taken into consideration. First, there is the level and nature of poverty. So not only sort of the degree, different levels of poverty, but also, for example, rural versus urban poverty. Then there are the governance characteristics, quite obvious to IB folks, like policy decisions, but also institutional characteristics. And then there are the country characteristics beyond governance. And here we mean that, this is especially in terms of communities and nonprofit organizations with which potential partnerships can be created with the goal of poverty alleviation. And then lastly, there's of course the industry effects. So be it mining or mobile or whatever, or mobile phones. And there's also some cross-industry comparisons. Now then, of course, finally, this leads to a proposal for a cross-disciplinary research agenda, and which covers the understudied elements and the other understudied interactions. So this can be understanding the differential impact of international business activities, which directly flows from the left-hand side. So similar phenomenon, but these are often studied separately. And there's often a disconnect between intent and results. The second is understanding the country and industry effects and the poverty dimensions. So for example, one of the interesting things is that there are hardly any studies on vulnerability, mostly on the first dimension of poverty. And of course, and then the final thing is understanding business activities as part of a broader system. And I think this is very important. The fact that we don't do this may explain also the inconclusiveness of results. So, well, there's much more to say about this, but I think I will stop here and hand back to Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Ans. I think you got us off to a really nice start with, I think, a nice broad overview of some of the issues and challenges related to studying international business in the context of a social challenge like poverty. So thank you for that. So our second presenter is Rajneesh Narula, again, someone who's probably familiar to most, if not all of you. He holds the John Dunning Chair of International Business Regulation at the Henley Business School. He also has a broad interdisciplinary research profile looking at multinationals in development, innovation, industrial policy, R&D. He also engages quite actively with practice, especially in public policy, working and consulting for the European Commission, OECD, and others. He's published in a number of top journals and received a number of awards, including the Order of the British Empire, which I think is quite impressive, at least I'm impressed. So today he'll be discussing his paper on enforcing higher labor standards within developing country value chain, consequences for MNEs and informal actors in a dual economy. Over to you, Rajneesh.
Thank you, Jonathan, and also thank you, Ans, for presenting a very nice introduction to what I want to talk about. I think that understanding the dimensions of poverty is really, really important. And one of the things that we tend to ignore is that developing countries tend to have a different and complex social structure. And this is reflected in what is known as the dual economy. I'm not going to explain the dual economy, but the idea that there are both formal actors who are part of the measured economy, and there are the informal actors that are people who are sometimes called the shadow economy, who are hidden away. Now, the thing is that in developing countries, the share of the population in the informal sector may be up to 90%. South Asia has about an 89% engagement in the informal economy. And sub-Saharan Africa, it's also about the same, 89 or 90%. This is quite a large part of the economy. And we know that global value chains in developing countries tend to have tend to take advantage of this formal-informal split. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit. So that's one of the kind of the critical, interesting, and novel aspects of this particular paper, and also my research more generally. So understanding how, when there are changes, exogenous changes happening, because stakeholders in the developed countries, for instance, ask for higher labor standards or higher levels of compliance, and so on, how it affects the supply chain in the developing country. How do the multinationals there respond to this? And that's what I'm focusing on. And what I'm trying to point out is that even though people are trying to do positive, good things, or there might be the intention of having higher labor standards is to do good things, is to have a good outcome, there are actually unintended negative outcomes. And that's what I want to bring to, I've tried to bring to the attention of JIB's readers. Now, I live in great fear of moving too slow or too fast, but I will try my best to find my way through this. So one of the interesting things that I'm also focusing on, I'm using here, by the way, I mentioned Rana Plaza, and Jonathan mentioned Rana Plaza earlier on. I'm interested in Rana Plaza partly because this research came out of a field trip to Bangladesh, but mainly I'm using Rana Plaza as a shock. It was a sudden. It acted as a kind of turning point in a sense. In many ways, external stakeholders suddenly took a great interest in labor standards and in health and safety issues. And there was a kind of a structural break in the way in which multinationals started seeing the situation. So prior to Rana Plaza, the way in which we've seen a breakup of value chains where before multinationals did everything internally to a point where they started doing what we call direct contract reasoning. That is, that you have non-equity relationships, but you have full control. So you maintain the control of all actors within your value chain, but you have no ownership of these actors. But you are responsible, therefore, in a sense, you have plausible deniability. You only are responsible for your immediate people who you have contracted with. Now, of course, when you have a country with a dual economy, the advantage of the dual economy is that formal firms are able to pay for things in cash to make quick agreements for goods purchase from informal actors. There are companies, there are organizations, there are enterprises which are like firms, but are not registered. They're off the books. And the advantage of off the books is that, there are many advantages, and these are primarily transactional in terms of costs. So it reduces the cost for the global value chain. Now, the informal sector is also a kind of a reservoir of surplus labor. So when demand is down, you don't have to worry about having too many people on your staff. You can lay them off much more easily because they are engaged in the informal sector. Now, if you look at value chains in Bangladesh or any of these countries, particularly in industries like apparel, the first tier firms tend to be formal, second tier tend to be both formal and informal, and the third tier is almost always informal. That is to say, they are single units specialized in particular activities, informal workshops, illegal, if you will. And subsistence workers working on small batches at home for a little extra cash. So this was how the world was shaped before Rana Plaza. After Rana Plaza, there was this pressure from external stakeholders to have higher monitoring and higher enforcement of labor standards, and the external stakeholders pushed for full chain compliance. But of course, this leads to a non-trivial increase in transaction costs. And of course, it's more challenging for the multinationals because how do you monitor a very large collection of economic actors, both formal and informal? And it is especially difficult to monitor informal actors who may or may not have an actual address. There might be people working at home and in the comfort of in some village somewhere. So there are literally thousands of these actors. So multinationals, the transaction costs of monitoring and enforcement rise exponentially once you have full chain accountability. So the solution has been actually is what is labeled as cascading accountability. So that is to say, tier one firms are responsible for their suppliers, and then tier two firms are responsible for their suppliers, and tier three firms are responsible for their suppliers. But the multinational is hands off because this way they don't have to pick up the cost of doing all the monitoring and enforcement. Now, this is an interesting model, and it's a cheaper model for the multinational, but unfortunately, it's not necessarily a good thing for society. And that's what the paper kind of talks about. That cascading helps the multinationals to keep the bottom line nice and plump. But and you can see tier one firms, the formal firms, have benefited because they've eliminated the non-compliant formal firms and non-compliant informal enterprises from their value chains, and they've increased their vertical integration and have achieved economies of scale. And they've invested in more machinery, more equipment, which reduces the costs. But the downside is that they've let go of all of their the surplus workers. They've replaced capital for labor. And this reduces their employment opportunities of these suppliers, and it also means that you're kind of you are creating, and a lot of these workers they're being let go tend to be women. So it kind of has a unbalanced effect on society. Now, one of the interesting things is like substituting capital for labor, you put in machinery, you need more skilled workers, and you need fewer unskilled workers. And this is again a problem for society. And I'm not going to explain all of this because I have a feeling I should run out of time if I do explain the nuances, and I don't want to be told off by Jonathan. So coming to the theoretical issues, so obviously you can see that the transaction cost discussion going on here, that multinational will find a way to keep their costs lower and their profit margins healthy, but it has an unintended consequence for society. And this of course illustrates the power asymmetry within the multinational-led GVC. It also leads to a conversation which has not yet been had in IB. That is to say, we have been talking about control boundaries of firms, which are different from the ownership boundaries of multinationals. But now we need to talk about the responsibility boundaries. And this is a conversation that has started in the ethics area, but has not yet quite made it into IB. And I think the other issue, of course, is that how does one actually achieve? It is asking a lot for multinationals to say, orchestrate, literally thousands of spot market transactions and expect them to actually make a profit. So there is a kind of an issue for the MNE, is how do you achieve full chain responsibility, but at the same time, keep your costs reasonable. I'm going to stop here and pass it back to Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Rajneesh. As I was reading your paper and hearing you speak, I was remembering many years ago when Walmart decided to become a much more sustainable company, and they were widely hailed around the world. And then I read that one consequence was that Walmart was dismissing literally thousands and thousands of suppliers in China because they were not able to adhere to Walmart's new sustainability standards. And so I think that's a very interesting set of observations about these unintended consequences. So thank you for that. Our third presenter is Anthony Gerzin, who's the Sobey Professor of International Business at the Smith School of Business at Queen's University, a co-authored paper in this case. And prior to academia, Anthony was a management consultant, so he brings some of that perspective to his research. He is president of the Academy of International Business Canada, so he's been a great foot soldier for us in the Great White North. He's published widely in a number of different journals, and today he's going to be talking about the effect of institutional pressures on business-led interventions to improve social compliance among emerging market suppliers in global value chains. So thank you for being with us, Anthony. Over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks all about our research. On behalf of Simon Iskander, one of my PhD students at Hofstadter, a colleague at Kedge Business School in France, is the effect of institutional pressures on business to improve social compliance among emerging market suppliers in global value chains. And I'm just reminded, what a mouthful. But the starting point, just one moment. There we go. Point of this research is the traditional approach to business that treats all inputs factors of production. And this quote from Henry exemplifies this idea. It's not the employers only handle the money, it's the customer. So this quote exemplifies, I think, the notion that powerful firms like Ford are to external conditions that are in turn supply and demand. And yet true, and the environment for that matter, as simply a factor of demand factors has become, for many, And as a result, what we're now seeing is the emergence of new rules that, and I'm referring, for example, to the Frank-Dodd, the UK Anti-Slavery Act, and that are on the books and being.
Anthony, sorry for disrupting.
Yeah.
We have problems hearing you, and we are wondering whether it's a bandwidth issue. Could you switch off your camera while you're doing the presentation? Maybe we can hear you better then. Thank you.
All right, all right, I'm hoping that will be better. Jonathan, should I carry on or should I restart or?
No, you were just cutting in and out. So I would say carry on without the camera. It sounds a little better. You're still in and out, but I would plow ahead and we'll try to make our best of it.
So the idea is that what we're seeing now, I think, is in several jurisdictions, like, for example, the Frank-Dodd Act, the UK Anti-Slavery Act, and I think many others, notion. And it reminds me of a comment in her presentation a few moments ago that this peripheral issue, but I think what's happening is that it was in the periphery, but is now becoming more as a of multinational. And nowhere is this issue perhaps more in the places where bottom of the pyramid dwells, where huge imbalances with supply demand for labor. So our research question has to do of the real and perceived workplace-related injustices within emerging markets, just referring to in Indonesia. GVC lead firms are improve their social standard compliance chains. Now, a common approach is to impose a standard of conduct that is sometimes, but not always, vetted by on-site audits. Research has shown, however, is that this approach had, at best, made slow improvement, leading to negative consequences, some of which So our research question: do interventions by GVC lead firms yield significant improvements in social standards among specifically on host country factors, elements that could be examined? Out that it's an empirical paper, but I'm going to keep it at a very high level, the underlying issues rather than to the weeds of the measures and SAM. The implication of our study is essentially that GVC firms, lead firms, and that's the multinationals that either have great market power or control over technologies, must account for the unique country-level institutional pressures that propel or sometimes hamper improvements in social and environmental standards along the GVC. In many cases, local conditions go directly against improvements in social standards. And what this research highlights is the enormous challenge. Again, this is something that Rajneesh was highlighting a moment ago, the enormous challenge that faces multinationals as they try to address these issues, because the issues change from one place to another. Bangladesh is different than India, is different than Taiwan, is different than China, etc. And the other issue highlights is that governments too need different or new policy responses to target prevailing institutional pressures that inherently dampen social upgrading if they are to attract. And with that,
Thank you, Anthony. I'm sorry you were coming in and out, and it seemed like you had finished, and I wasn't 100% positive. I think we captured most of what you shared with us here, and I think we did our best under the circumstance. So thank you for your patience and your cooperation. So we do have a number of questions in the Q&A. I want to thank all three presenters. I think you really got us off to a nice start in terms of bringing different perspectives to bear on the issue. So I'm going to start with a couple questions that relate mostly to Rajneesh's presentation. They have to do with governance of supply chains, and I'm going to kind of combine them up here. But I think Rajneesh, you nicely explained this construct of cascading supply chains, but you didn't necessarily give us a normative solution to what we do about it. And so we had a couple questions about how you would allocate roles and agency and governance responsibility within this cascading supply chain. And then another related to how do we study such a supply chain when it's really occurring at multiple levels of analysis. So I think there's curiosity about the construct of cascading supply chain, how we can learn more about it, but also what are some of the governance approaches that we might make to respond to these unintended consequences that you described for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. This is indeed two very, very difficult questions. But I will try and obfuscate as much as possible. And so I think the first thing is governance. What do firms do? And I think this is actually a very interesting transaction cost challenge, because what firms do mostly is they outsource the compliance requirements to private companies, Veritas, and the companies that exist, whose primary purpose is to do the paperwork to check for compliance. And this is what has happened, is that you give it to somebody else to do, and of course these companies are doing it for money. Now, this is a socially suboptimal solution, because they are following a checklist, and if you meet the checklist and you pay the money for the registration, you succeed in getting a certificate that says you have a fire extinguisher and you have a fire escape, and so on and so forth. Now, expecting multinationals, of course, this way they kind of, again, it's you eliminate cascading responsibility. You're given the responsibility to a private agent to take care of it for you. So the solution really is that, in terms of engaging with the informal actors, is to not to have the same standard, one size fits all. This is the standard for everybody, whether you're a 500 employee firm or you're just a housewife sitting in your kitchen sewing buttons, and having a more nuanced approach. But this costs money. And of course, what happens in a multinational or a big company is the profit margins are always an issue, and you say to yourself, why should I pick up this cost? I will transfer this cost downward. So I don't see, unless there is an immediate solution to this problem, without expecting multinationals to act more charitable and accept a cut to the bottom line. The natural instinct is the power balance means that the person who picks up the cost will always be further down the food chain, or the value chain in this case. I think that studying this is a big problem, because nobody wants to talk to you about this. These companies, again, are living on wafer thin margins, and the idea that you complain about the money you're making, you're not going to get more money, again, because of the power asymmetry. And the second problem, of course, is that we have difficulty in measuring the informal economy in any case. And even in the developed countries, measuring the informal sector, especially because a large amount of informal sector has to do with also has to do with things that are illegal, like crime. The mafia is a large part of the informal sector, but we have no idea how large it is.
Thank you, Rajneesh. We had another question for you, Ans, and one that I had actually when I read your paper. Clearly, you were looking at a broad range of literatures on multinationals and poverty, obviously not just IB literature, but development studies and a whole range of literatures. And there's a question that came up having to do with mainstream versus responsible globalization. First of all, can we really categorize one kind of globalization in one category and one in the other? And then a question was really about, on the ground, isn't it kind of a combination of the two? Is it really the case that we can put some types of globalization in one basket and some in another, or do we need to examine really how it's unfolding on the ground? And one of our questioners talked about sort of a kind of a perverse effect of waste being created by basically consumer products companies, and that waste not being internalized and being addressed by those companies. And I think we would perhaps call that irresponsible globalization. But a little bit more about mainstream and responsible globalization, and also is that really a suitable categorization, or is what happening on the ground really some combination of the two?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I fully understand the question about responsible globalization, but we focus on poverty alleviation, and there is a stream of literature, especially within development economics and studies, about which really looks at the type of globalization meant to with the idea of alleviating poverty. So a responsible way of globalization. Now, I fully agree that within the globalization as a whole, I mean, there's been a long discussion about positive and negative effects, and here it is really about the negative effects of, let's say, mainstream globalization. And of course, I mean, there's a whole range of, but the interesting thing is that different literatures study different components of it, but don't talk to one another. And I thought that within IB, we can do a nice job in connecting these, studying we study the same phenomena, but then we do it in a different way. And of course, I mean, at the end of the day, if you look at a particular multinational firm in a particular industry, then you see all these different things coming together. I mean, if I relate to what Rajneesh was just saying, I mean, I have another paper which is published in Critical Perspectives on International Business. And I mean, there you see not just, I mean, that producers are pushing it down the value chain to the informal sector, but even, I mean, especially in the apparel industry, you've seen that there are two different types of global value chains that have emerged. So one is the formal one, where they have started to implement audits, have auditors, they try to be responsible within their sort of like mainstream globalization, but then they also start to use importing companies where they're basically, no CSR types of requirements. So, I mean, that even within, so of course the two are connected, but the way we try to study it is simply because there is a separate stream of literature that really tries to focus on poverty alleviation. So, for example, companies saying like, well, as part of our commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, we commit to responsible globalization. So that was a little literature stream, much smaller to which we refer here.
Got it. Thank you. We had a question for you, Anthony, from Ari Banash, asking about which types of policies lend themselves to promote social compliance and which type inhibit it. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about the practices that you were investigating in your study and how they appeared to be affecting the social performance of the suppliers.
Sure. Let me just see if I can't share my. So this, what we did was we looked at third-party interventions, and and that is what we're describing as codes of imposing codes of conduct on suppliers. And we examined the different kinds of attributes that that exist at the country level that are from the World Bank research, have to do with voice and accountability, rule of law, control of corruption, political stability, government effectiveness or independence, and regulatory quality. And what we found was that although the World Bank intends this as an examine quality of government, the results vary by each of these individual attributes. So we find that, for example, voice and accountability and rule of law improve the effectiveness of these interventions, whereas political stability, government independence, regulatory quality all seem to have a dampening effect. And our sense is that it has something to do with the negative incentives to stricter regulation. So there are certain governments that, while they may be able to improve social standards at the local level, they actually are choosing not to, because that would reduce their country level. They see themselves competing against their neighbors. And so we're seeing that it's not a kind of a monolithic kind of approach. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. If you could just stop sharing your screen and we can get back to the dialogue, but thank you for that response. So a question that I'd like to pose to the panelists that was at least alluded to or implied in your research has to do with the role and responsibility of government versus what is sometimes called private regulation or voluntary regulation. So I'm wondering if I could just maybe start with you, Rajneesh, and ask you to say a word about your own view of the complementarity or even the conflict between relying upon sort of the goodwill of multinationals and NGOs in these codes of conduct versus really trying to get governments to step up and perhaps do what they should have done to begin with.
Well, I think this is also about government failure in some cases, and it's something we don't talk about very much either in international business nor in as much or as one should in development economics. You can see how governments are stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they want FDI. And FDI is important because it creates employment, it creates the capital flows and all of that type of thing. And they don't want to start being too picky because any employment is better than no employment, if you see what I mean. So kind of why do you want to drive people away and say we're only going to do sustainable, socially responsible investments, and if we start monitoring them too hard, we lose all this investment. So there is that one challenge. There's also a question of state capture, regulatory capture, because many of the owners of these factories tend to be politicians as well, or at least they have extended families and they have connections and so forth. So there's a second problem here. So I think that expecting governments to enforce, they might sign up to all these kind of things, but expecting them to actually be able to enforce this is again, I think it's a problem of multiple principles and being pulled between social pressures and economic pressure. So this is the problem. And I think that the constant search for balance between NGOs wanting things and persuading people that it's better to have one meal a day, which comes from responsible work, as opposed to getting 2 meals a day from doing irresponsible work, is not a choice one should give people. Very hard to justify this.
Thank you, Rajneesh. We had the very first question, actually, before we even got into the Q&A session. I was kind of pushing it off because I thought it might be better to save it to a little bit later, but others have kind of alluded to it. And that has to do with when we study issues that transcend business, society, development, we face some challenges. And some of those challenges are related to the approach that we bring to the research itself, and perhaps among other things, its multi-level nature. But also the first question had to do with the fact that some disciplines have certain assumptions embedded in them that may be in conflict with assumptions that are embedded in others. And so I'm actually going to start this one with Ans. In particular, the suggestion was that in development studies and say public health, there's kind of a natural skepticism of the role of multinationals in developing and emerging economies. Not to say there's a strong normative bias against them, but there's an assumption that they may have some negative consequences. We might say that in IB or in strategy, the assumption tends to kind of lean in the opposite direction. So Ans, when you're integrating and bringing those literatures together, how do you reconcile the fact that we come at them from not just different disciplinary perspectives, but maybe different embedded assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, that is a tricky one. I mean, because I mean, even in management studies, I mean, there's critical management studies, and there is I mean, I don't think it's per se. I mean, the starting point is per se different in management. Although in IB, I mean, well, if you start from the firm and from a more managerial perspective, you of course zoom in on how can we improve management and how can we improve the functions and the operations of international business. I always try to look at sort of like what at the end of the day, what are they trying to study? And so what is the empirical approach and what are the assumptions there? So we had a paper on the MNE wage premium, which has been studied a lot in economics, but then it's also based on certain assumptions about multinationals paying more or less. And there, I mean, you can still make the bridge if you simply boil down to what is it that they actually study. So beyond the conceptual pieces only where they come up with certain assumptions, I think you can merge the things. I mean, we've also been studying a lot of these things about corporate social responsibility standards or codes of conduct, or how you want to call them, multi-stakeholder initiatives to regulate corporate behavior in global value chains. We have quite some, I mean, and there's a huge literature in public policy and in governance, political science, and in business and management. And I mean, it's still possible if you focus on the actual object of study to see what they're doing. And I think, but coming back to poverty, to what we're presenting today, I mean, in poverty, it is an issue that well, management scholars tend to focus on income levels and then the whole complexity related. So that's why I spent some time explaining the 5 dimensions. I mean, it's really complex to study this. Well, at the same time, it's very interrelated. So that requires really some deep thinking for IB scholars on how to really study this, and leaving aside the different assumptions. I mean, it is that, well, we focus on how we can measure it, and then I mean, you lose the complexity of what happens in different types of societies. So do you also want me to answer? I mean, there's a lot of doom and gloom, I mean, related to the policy. I mean, what can we do to improve it? Or relating to Rajneesh's question, I think there is some light in the sense that the EU, there are international standards trying to do something. I mean, for example, in the area of mining and minerals, I mean, there is EU regulation. So it's not all, I mean, but I think the government should have, government and international organizations should have a clear role there. But
thank you, Hans. Rajneesh, I'm going to go back over to you for a somewhat related question that we already explored with Hans a little bit, and it has to do with the theoretical foundations of responsible globalization, of responsible international business. Is there enough kind of conceptual and theoretical rigor there to really define and explicate, what we mean when we say responsible globalization or responsible international business practices?
You know, Jonathan, that is possibly the most philosophical question you could come up with. And it almost sounds like an oxymoron. And it takes me back straight to Karl Marx, because that, in fact, was the conversation, not just Karl Marx, but it goes back to much earlier to Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, discussed poverty in great detail, as a matter of fact. So the question was always has always been asked is, how does one make sure that the workers and get a fair share of the pie compared to the capitalists or the firm owners? Let's not use the word capitalist. And this has been the conversation going on for 500 years, probably longer. And I'm not certain that we're going to come up with a solution. Certainly, self-regulation doesn't work. It isn't something that every time you see a company, saying they're quite happy to self-regulate because they know how to be morally responsible. I find this very hard to believe. They sign up to codes of conduct, and these codes of conduct are not always adhered to in any significant level. We have plenty of evidence to this fact. So I don't think that. I think that in the end it is a combination of government enforced regulations, both at the host level and at the home level. We can see from the evidence that the external stakeholders come from the developed countries. We've seen this in the mining industry, that the Canadian population really wants their mining companies to behave well. But when we look at the evidence on the ground, it's CSR is just it's something they do as to tick a box, and it isn't always as significant as we as the consumers in the rich countries expect it to be.
Thank you, Rajneesh. Anthony, over to you. We had a question about the sometimes conflict between the way CSR is defined in different jurisdictions. In this case, perhaps the host and home country concepts of what really is CSR, what we're looking to accomplish. And I'd like to just add a question onto that. In reading your paper, it appeared to me as if you conclude that the frequency and intensity of these third-party audits of suppliers have diminishing returns. So they're kind of effective in the early part of the frontier, but then their effectiveness kind of peters out. So could you take a stab at those two somewhat related questions?
One of the findings in our paper is that there seems to be diminishing returns. And in fact, when we two audits, so that may well be an indication of low-hanging fruit. There are companies that find it easy to do certain things, and if it's easy, if it doesn't increase my transaction costs, sure, I'll do it because somebody asked and it's no problem. When more carefully, what we have found, in fact, a small group of firms that go out, the majority, however, do actually fairly little. And then at a certain period of time, that then diminishes. So incentives, I think, for local firms is something that needs a lot of attention. How do we go creating the incentives for local firms? And I think also the point that I was trying to talk about my paper is that there are, I think, many regulations that are coming into effect on the developed world side, and I'll refer to the Dodd-Frank Act, for example, the UK Slavery Act. These are that are putting teeth into the requirement for firms to get themselves organized on these fronts. And GVC governance is a peripheral issue is actually coming into the mainstream, and I think we will expect it in that trend.
Thank you, Anthony. And thanks for that reminder that some of these expectations have now become part of formal law and regulation, like the requirement of the Dodd-Frank Act that multinationals, especially those in the minerals area, more closely track the source of their products. We have a couple questions here sort of back to the issue of national versus global governance. And I think it's coming at the same topic we discussed a few moments ago, but more from the perspective of the fact that we really have dozens or hundreds of individual national governmental jurisdictions that are looking after their own practices within their individual states. But we have multinationals that are transcending those states. And how do multinationals navigate the fact that we don't have any sort of global governance understanding of these practices? In some senses, they're arbitraging between and among the practices of these states. So Rajneesh, is this something you've given some thought, again, kind of extending the discussion that we had just a few moments ago?
Yes, well, I think this is, I was just reading an interview of Immelt, the former GE CEO on the, I think it was the New York Times this week, who was talking about how Welch did a lot of wage arbitrage, and that was his model, was moving things abroad, and he described it as wage arbitrage. And I think and there's also regulatory arbitrage. You kind of seek the way, you want to look at the bottom line. The firms are not in the business. Their primary role is to make their shareholders happy. And their shareholders are not necessarily the same people as who are working for them. So I think this is always going to be a problem, that they were unlikely ever to have this single uniform binding regulation. We have non-binding regulation produced by the OECD. The United Nations passes all of these interesting things about there'll be no poverty by 2020, 2030, whatever it is, but they're not binding in any way. So there is this fundamental problem that these are advisory, and people happily sign up to them because it looks good. It's a camera opportunity to say, yes, we will have no poverty by 2030, but nobody is willing to put their money down and actually do anything about it. Politics being what it is, you have a 5-year, at the most 5-year or 4-year span to the next election, and unfortunately, companies are also happily. This regulatory arbitrage is something no one has written about, to my knowledge, but I believe it is a subject worthy of study.
Thank you, Rajneesh. We had another question having to do with the potential conflicting impacts or countervailing impacts of, on the one hand, having a low wage, low cost environment and therefore attracting FDI. But on the other, we have this evidence that having strong institutions and legal protections and other soft infrastructure, let's call it, helps itself attract FDI, but might be costly. So we have these kind of dual effects. And the questioner was speculating that perhaps in the early stages of development, the sheer wage and cost differential is what really drives FDI. And then perhaps, I'm paraphrasing here, countries can afford to invest in the soft infrastructure and the business systems that allow for the protection of intellectual property, contracts, et cetera, et cetera. Is that a scenario that you would agree with, Rajneesh, or not necessarily?
No, I don't agree with this. I think that, yes, going for the lowest and the cheapest bit of the value chain, that is to say, this is what happens with mining companies. You go into these dead poor countries, no regulatory stuff, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you exploit these resources at zero cost, and you create this huge mess. I don't think that even in the short run, this is a good outcome. I think that they go hand in hand. One can go to the look at Rwanda, for instance, which has gone towards the direction of trying to be have ethical approaches and so forth, and finding a balance. Singapore also did this. Korea did this to some extent. Yes, a certain flexibility in regulation is probably a good thing, but free for all, then we're back into a kind of a cowboys type of situation, which is good for nobody, neither the host country nor the multinational.
Thank you, Rajneesh.
May I follow up?
Sure, please, Tom.
I think, I mean, the problem is, of course, that, I mean, all this is very country specific and also industry specific. So if we talk sort of in broad strokes, I think we miss a lot of the nuances. I mean, if you look at, for example, textiles or garment or in Indonesia, I mean, which is a huge country, where a lot of production takes place. I think there are like 50 different minimum wages. So in the different regions of Indonesia. So I mean, talking about and some of the activities in terms of production you can replace, relocate easily, and others you cannot. I mean, if we're talking about mining and minerals, I mean, if we're talking about the energy transition, there are certain metals or minerals that you definitely need to source from particular types of countries. So it's not so easy to relocate. So I think it really, I mean, we really need to fine tune on what exactly are we talking about. Also because, I mean, different sub-regions within a big country are not necessarily the same. I think what COVID has shown us is that even within countries, so countries are very different, but even within countries, sub-regions, I mean, can be very different. So I think while for IB scholars, it's particularly interesting to do broad strokes and multinationals operate in one country and can move stuff around. And I think many multinationals in a particular industry, and if you interact with managers, they really suffer from the fact that there's so much complexity. So in terms of wages, I mean, multinationals seek intermediaries. So who can inform them about what is it? For example, there is a movement towards some multinationals as part of responsible globalization, starting to think about what are decent wages, but then they struggle, like, what is a decent wage in Indonesia? Well, where you are.
Well, that's interesting because we're struggling with that ourselves in the United States, where we also have at least 50 different minimum wages and no meaningful national minimum wage. So it's apparently, at least in our case, that's a first world as well as a developing country problem. Hans, I have another question for you, a little bit more specific. How do you position the role of aid agencies and NGOs within this framework of international business and multinationals contributing either positively or negatively to poverty reduction?
Yeah, I think they would be part of the more responsible globalization part. They would be, in terms of firm-specific advantages, they would be the ones that firms can collaborate with, be it at the global level or at the local level, and especially at the community level. And of course, they would be sort of advocates or part of a responsible globalization movement. Which I think, I mean, although you can be skeptical like Rajneesh was, which I mean, I agree with to some extent. I think there are also, I mean, the fact that there is globalization and that we have digitalization also means that people who are in favor of more responsible globalization can also team up more easily. And I think in this space, you can see a lot of like small initiatives that can easily become bigger, like, you know, food waste recycling initiatives that you can replicate across different locations and these types of activities. So I mean, thanks to globalization, we can sort of like learn about good initiatives that we can do. So, and I think there is space for NGOs, for aid agencies, for all types of initiatives, social entrepreneurs to become part of that.
Thank you. We have a somewhat related question from Katie Kenny on whether or not these non-binding agreements, these codes of conduct and self-regulation could at times do more harm than good, in the sense that they may be relatively low-cost investments to keep formal regulation at bay, to essentially allow the multinational its unbridled choice of operating practices while appearing to invest to some minimal degree in these social initiatives. Anthony or Rajneesh, do you have any opinion about that? I suppose it's maybe a little hard to generalize. I'm sure those circumstances do happen. I'm not sure if that's the rule or the exception.
I can just jump in quickly, Rajneesh, if I could. Are many of these regulations, are they imperfect? Absolutely. I mean, you could view them as perhaps like a fish net. If you make the net too small, it will catch things you don't want. If you make it too big, it lets things go that you wanted to catch. So I think it's an art to create these kinds of regulations that catch only the things that we want and let only the things that we want to let go to pass through. So I think that's an art, and I think that's something that is a learning experience. I think that we are sort of as a human population, I think we are new to this, how to go about governing global institutions. I would say the short answer is we don't know how to do it. But I think this is the way to start. I think that regulations like the Dodd-Frank Act, like the UK Slavery Act, and many others that are being looked at, I think they are the way forward. And I would say also, I don't really agree with with framing the issue as having something to do with either management or MNE incompetence or worse. The MNE managers that I've spoken to about this very issue are very smart, very hardworking, very sincere, really would like to make a dent. But I think to Anne's point a moment ago, these issues are extremely complicated, and even experts who spend all of their time thinking about, let's say, minimum wage, there isn't a consensus. There's disagreement, and so here we're asking firms that not that long ago, the central idea in strategic management was stick to your knitting. I would argue, actually, if there's one lesson that every strategic management professor tries to impart to his students, it's that you need to stick to your knitting. The notion of core competence, of leveraging your unique resources and capabilities. But what we're doing now is when we start to focus on issues that relate to social responsibility, these very important issues, we're drawing firms well outside of their wheelhouse, right? This is not how they became successful. This is not what made them profitable or important companies to start with. But it will, I think, be a metric that many consumers, investors, and regulators will use in the future to decide which companies should be supported and which don't deserve our support. So I think that it's a learning experience, this notion of how to build a regulatory environment that achieves the purposes that we want. At the same time, when we look at the literature, what we see already is full of examples of unintended consequences, where you think, for example, just one example, Rajneesh's idea of formal versus informal and economy, and the going in position may well be that a formal economy is better than an informal one. But what we find is that when economies move from informal to formal, there are many people who get hurt in the balance, right? People who were doing okay now suddenly are excluded. There's lots of examples of this. So my sense is that I think this is the way forward, but we should expect lots of bumps on the road.
Thank you, Anthony. I think I'm going to move on here because we're now since we're near the end, we have a flurry of questions coming in. One of them I'm going to direct Ans's way. It has to do with, from Marcus Tausig, has to do with impact analysis. And he observes that in the development community, like in bilateral development agencies or the World Bank, there's typically these formal, impact analysis that use a particular methodology and modeling and whatnot. Whereas when we look at CSR activities, or whatever we want to call multinationals' contributions to social impact, we don't typically use a real scientific method, controls, et cetera. And so we engage in a lot of speculating. Hans, do you think we could learn something from the development economics tradition of Rajneesh as well, that would allow us to bring more rigor and precision to trying to track the impacts of multinationals, especially when they're claiming to have positive impacts?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think we in the paper we also refer to the randomized control trials that are being used by Nobel Prize winners and so on. And I think, I mean, the interesting thing is that companies also often engage NGOs precisely for this. So to make such an assessment. But of course, I mean, the point is that they are made for these aid agencies or NGOs to evaluate their own impacts. And that is not translatable one-to-one either to multinationals or to what we do in terms of research. I also want to relate to Anthony's point. I think what multinationals are struggling with is also what governments are struggling with. So if the EU comes up with minerals regulation and tells companies like, okay, well, you should figure out where your inputs come from, and then they also don't know the intricacies of these issues on the ground. And so they usually come up with sort of like, well, you should do a due diligence, which is, related to what these aid organizations also tend to do. So that's why they start to engage these types of, but I mean, they're all struggling with this. And it also means that for us as scholars to use these types of activities in a sort of contested area where they also don't know to apply it, brings us into sort of, well, another set of consultants trying to invent some sort of methodology. So that is so it's definitely very interesting stuff, but I think before we'll be able to use it, it will take some time.
Rajneesh, quick comment on your end.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we don't appreciate, as given the strong kind of economics and management bias that we come with in international business, we ignore the sociology of societies. But the problem, of course, is the sociology is that we're dealing, how do you create groups, and how do you avoid stereotypes, and so on and so forth. So applying a more rigorous scientific method to studying groups, I mean, there are 100 ethical challenges just on their own. I think that we need to revisit. But I also want to go back to Anthony's comment, which was very, very useful. And one of the things that I commented on recently in a chapter I'm writing for a book is the idea of smart regulation. That is to say, we have this tendency to just have one size of a regulation, one size fits all firms. And it's about making the net bigger or smaller depending upon your objective. That is to say, for instance, patent law, we assume that every item of novelty gets the same width and length of patent. Now, we haven't even got to be able to find a way of adapting this for different product classes. But the same thing needs to apply for intellectual property rights. For certain activity, there shouldn't be any IPR. Food, we shouldn't be able to patent food, for instance, but we do have the same regulations that allow that. And as opposed to pharma, and where is the line, and how do we modify this as we move to different development levels? The host country changes. It's an interesting topic of its own, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rajneesh. I think we're reaching the end of our time together here. I really want to thank our presenters and their co-authors, Hans, Rajneesh, and Anthony, for these very interesting papers and presentations. I want to thank the participants here for a really rigorous and stimulating and wide-ranging conversation. A reminder about the special issue I mentioned earlier, and I'll turn things back over to Klaus Meyer to wrap things up. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for asking excellent questions. Thanks for the audience for asking very good questions. And I think we should apologize to all those whose questions we haven't been able to voice. We're already running over time. We'll try to reply to some of the issues offline. Also, thank you for the participants. I'm tempted to ask about half a dozen questions right now because there's so many things that are coming up. Just one issue that I do want to raise, even though we don't have the time to answer the question, and that is what John Lewis asked in the Q&A is, are we advocating a northern agenda for the southern world? Are a lot of the CSR conversations really representing certain interests in the north as opposed to what people say in the south? And just from, I'm not a specialist in this area, but when I was doing work in Vietnam years ago, a common view that I got from local people is like this CSR thing, these standards, that's really a new form of trade barriers. They're trying to undermine our competitiveness. We need those jobs for our development. And it also raises issues of causality, is certain inequality issues and the social issue. Is it an issue of economic development, industrialization, or is it the global value chains that are the culprit here? Or is it, how do the causality is really a big question, and which I haven't heard so much about. So, but the bottom line is we have a huge research agenda here. And I think what this webinar really has shown that different people within our community approach this issue in different ways. And this conversation brings out a lot of things that go beyond the biases that some people have pointed to that we do have. And we all have our personal biases, but unfortunately also communities have certain biases, including scholarly communities. We have to be aware of that to be able to address it. And I think this webinar has gone a good way towards doing that. Both our journals obviously try to overcome those biases. So there are plenty of opportunities to continue the conversation. The AIB special interest group has been mentioned, and the special issue that Jonathan and his co-authors are editing. I just want to share with you, we are working on another webinar, which is specifically focusing on business in highly volatile environments, experiences from Africa. And we're also working on a webinar on the impact of COVID on the operations of global businesses. So watch the AIB announcements. Those probably will happen sometime in March. We haven't scheduled them. So thank you again, everyone.